The air inside the concert hall was heavy, filled with a scent that seemed to mix expensive perfume, old wood, and the distinct metallic temps of anxiety. It was a place where history had happened, where famous musicians had stood for over a century. But today, the atmosphere wasn't just about history, it was about judgment. Rows upon rows of velvet seats stretched back like waves in a red ocean, most of them occupied by people who looked as if they had been born wearing tuxedos and expensive jewelry. They sat with their arms crossed, their expressions set in a polite but bored mask, waiting to be impressed, though secretly hoping not to be disappointed backstage. Behind a heavy velvet curtain that blocked out the view of the grand stage, Ilara sat on a hard wooden chair. Her knees were pressed tightly together. In her lap, she clutched her sheet music so hard that her knuckles had turned white. The paper was crinkled at the edges from hours of practice and nervous sweating. She smoothed it out with a trembling hand, taking a deep, shaky breath. She looked around the small, dim room. Other musicians were there too, tuning instruments or whispering in hushed tones, but no one looked at her. She was invisible here. She didn't belong to their world. She was the outlier, was the one who had slipped through the cracks of the strict audition process. A tall man with a clipboard walked by, his shoes clicking sharply on the concrete floor. He stopped in front of her, looking down his nose. "You're up next," he said, his voice flat and uninterested. He didn't wait for a reply before moving on. Ilara stood up. Her legs felt like lead weights. She smoothed down her skirt. It was a modest thing, simple and dark, bought secondhand years ago. It looked nothing like the flowing silk gowns the other female performers were wearing. As she walked toward the stage door, she caught her reflection in a mirror leaning against the wall. A young woman, with tired eyes and hair pulled back too tightly, stared back. She tried to smile, hoping it would give her courage. The smile looked fake and shaky. The stage manager gave her a nod and pulled back the heavy curtain. The sudden wall of sound that hit her was deafening. It wasn't music. It was the sound of 1,000 people shifting in their seats, coughing and murmuring. As she stepped out into the bright lights, the murmuring seemed to dip, then rise again, like a tide pulling back before crashing. She walked toward the massive grand piano sitting in the center of the stage. It looked like a shiny black beast, gleaming under the spotlights. The walk to the piano felt like the longest journey of her life. Every step was an effort. She could feel hundreds of eyes boring into her back. She felt exposed, as if she were walking onto a stage without any clothes on. They were judging her before she even played a single note. They were looking at her shoes, her hair, her simple dress, deciding she wasn't worth their time. She reached the bench and sat down. The leather was cool and smooth. She adjusted the height, a nervous habit. Then she placed her sheet music on the rack. Her hands hovered over the keys, ready to start. The silence slowly settled over the room, the way dust settles in a sunbeam. This was the moment. This was what she had worked for. She took a breath to begin the first complex movement of the piece she had practiced for months. Then, a voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Stop," the voice boomed. It came from the judges' table on the right side of the stage. Ilara froze, her hands hovering in midair. Her heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up, squinting against the bright lights to see who had spoken. It was the head judge. It's an older man with silver hair and a face that looked as if it had been carved from stone. He didn't look at her with kindness. He didn't even look at her with professional curiosity. He looked at her with a sort of lazy dismissal, as if she were a fly that had landed on his dinner. He leaned into his microphone, the feedback causing a sharp screech that made the audience wince. "Please don't start with that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have heard enough difficult pieces today. It is all too much noise." Ilara didn't know what to do. She lowered her hands to her lap, but didn't stand up. She looked at him, confused. The audience began to murmur again. People shifted in their seats, craning their necks to see the drama unfolding. The judge sighed, a long, exaggerated sound that was picked up by the microphone. He took a sip of water, slowly, before speaking again. "Look at you," he said, gesturing vaguely in her direction with a wave of his hand. "You look nervous." That piece is too advanced for someone who clearly isn't comfortable on stage." A few low chuckles rippled through the crowd. Ilara felt her face burn with heat. The humiliation was hot and sharp, pricking at her eyes. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to run off the stage and hide in the dark safety of the backstage area. But her feet felt glued to the floor. "Let's make it simple," the judge continued, his tone changing from bored to mockingly sweet. "Since you look like you need a break, why don't you play something easy? Something we can all hum along to." The other judges on the panel shuffled their papers. One looked away, uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up to stop him. They held the power here. They held her future in their hands. If she argued, she would lose. If she walked off, she would never be invited back. "How about chopsticks?" the judge suggested, and a louder wave of laughter moved through the audience. It was a joke. A cruel, public joke. Or maybe "Twinkle, twinkle, little star"? You know that one, don't you? "Let's keep it within your skill level." The laughter wasn't raucous. It was the polite laughter of people who felt superior. It was the sound of the elite laughing at the expense of the commoner. Ilara sat frozen on the bench. The black and white keys of the piano stared back at her, blurring slightly as tears threatened to spill over. She was being humiliated in front of 1,000 people. They weren't there to hear music. They were there to see a show, and right now, she was the punchline. "Go on," the judge pressed, tapping his pen on the table. "We haven't got all day. Just play a simple tune. Give us something pleasant. Don't try to be a genius if you aren't one." The words hung in the air. "Don't try to be a genius." Ilara looked down at her hands. They were small hands, calloused at the fingertips from years of practice, years of playing on broken instruments in cold rooms. She thought of the early mornings, the late nights, the sacrifices she had made just to sit on this bench. She thought of the music she carried inside her. The music that was complex and deep and anything but simple. The judge leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. He expected her to cry. He expected her to fumble through "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" with a shaking voice, proving him right, proving that she didn't belong. He expected her to be a victim. The audience quieted down, waiting for the spectacle. The silence that returned was different now. It was hungry. It was waiting for her failure. Ilara took a slow breath. She closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the blinding lights, shutting out the sneering face of the judge, shutting out the velvet sea of people. In that darkness, she found a tiny spark of anger. It wasn't a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, hard resolve. It was a steel rod that straightened her spine. She realized then that she had a choice. She could play their game and be a joke, or she could play her game and show them who she really was. She could walk away right now and save her pride, or she could stay and fight them with the only weapon she had. Her eyes snapped open. The tears were gone, replaced by a glassy, sharp focus. She didn't move from the bench. She didn't adjust her music. In fact, with a calm, deliberate movement, she reached out and closed the folder that held her sheet music. She pushed it to the side of the piano, leaving the rack bare. The judge noticed the movement. He raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering just a fraction. "I said a simple tune," he barked into the mic, his voice losing its mock sweetness and gaining an edge of irritation. "Do as you were told." Ilara ignored him. She turned her body slightly on the bench, squaring her shoulders to the instrument. She placed her left foot on the sustain pedal, testing it gently. It felt firm under her shoe. She looked at the keys again. They were no longer blurring. They were sharp and clear. She knew exactly where every single one of them was. She didn't need paper to tell her what to do. The music wasn't on the page. It was in her blood, rushing through her veins with the beat of her heart. The audience sensed a shift. The murmuring stopped completely. The air in the hall seemed to tighten, like a bowstring being pulled back. Something was about to happen. The young woman in the modest dress, the one they had laughed at, wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking anymore. Ilara raised her hands. She didn't place them in the starting position of a child's nursery rhyme. She stretched her fingers wide, creating a span that covered a full octave. Her right hand hovered high above the keys while her left hand dipped low, ready to strike the bass notes with power, The judge opened his mouth to speak again, to demand she leave the stage. But before he could make a sound, her hands came down. The moment her fingers made contact with the ivory keys, the entire atmosphere in the hall seemed to shatter. It wasn't the gentle, tentative plinking of a nursery rhyme. It wasn't the polite, expected melody of chopsticks. Instead, a massive, discordant sound exploded from the piano, filling the vast space like a sudden crack of thunder. It was a chord that didn't seem to belong in a concert hall. It was angry, rough, and jagged. The people in the front row physically flinched. One woman dropped her program, the sound of it hitting the floor barely audible over the lingering vibration of the strings. The judge who had mocked her froze with his mouth half open, his hand still gripping the microphone. The smug look on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pure confusion. He stared at the stage, blinking rapidly, as if trying to clear his vision. But Alara didn't stop. She didn't wait for their permission. She didn't wait for the shock to fade. She launched into a run of notes that was so fast it made the air blur. Her left hand hammered out a deep, driving rhythm in the lower register. A heartbeat that thumped against the chests of everyone in the room. It felt like a war drum, primal and insistent. Her right hand danced across the higher keys, playing notes that were sharp and piercing, cascading like shards of glass falling down a staircase. For the first 10 seconds, the hall was paralyzed. The audience sat in stunned silence. They had come expecting a farce, a cringe-worthy moment where a girl would fail at a simple task. They were ready to pity her. But this was not pity. This was aggression. Ilara's body language had completely transformed. The timid posture, the hunched shoulders, the fearful gaze, all of it was gone. She sat tall on the bench, her back straight, her head held high. Her eyes were locked, not on the keys, but on some distant point above the audience's heads, as if she were seeing something they couldn't. She wasn't playing for them anymore. She wasn't playing to please a judge. She was playing to survive. The music she was creating wasn't a standard classical piece. It sounded like a storm. It was chaotic but controlled, a swirling vortex of sound that defied the simple rules of harmony the elite audience was used to. She took the simple melody the judge had mocked her, with the playful, innocent tune of a child, and she warped it. She twisted it into something dark and complex. She played the rhythm of that simple song, but she layered it with dissonance and heavy chords until it was unrecognizable. It was a mockery of his mockery. The judge leaned forward, his face turning a shade of red. He looked at the other judges, his eyes wide, silently asking if they should stop her. But none of them moved. They were mesmerized. The technical difficulty of what she was doing was undeniable. Her fingers were moving with a blur of speed that seemed impossible for a human being. They were independent, precise, and incredibly strong. In the fifth row, an older man who had been a critic for 30 years reached up and slowly removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes as if he couldn't trust what he was hearing. He had heard thousands of pianists in his career, students and masters alike, but he had never heard anything like this. There was a rawness to it, a bleeding emotion that usually got polished out of musicians by the time they reached a stage this big. This wasn't polished. It was dangerous. Ilara's hands flew across the keyboard. She wasn't just pressing keys. She was attacking them. The piano was singing, screaming under her touch. The sound rose in volume, filling every corner of the hall, bouncing off the high ceiling and the velvet curtains. It washed over the audience, hitting them with a physical force. A young student sat near the back, slumped in his seat, bored and checking his watch when the performance began. Now he sat upright, his eyes wide. He felt a chill run down his spine. The music was telling a story without words. It was a story of struggle, of being held down, of being told you are nothing. And then it was a story of fighting back. The notes seemed to claw their way up from the bottom of the piano, fighting against the heavy bass until they soared into a high, trilling scream that made the hairs on his arms stand up. On stage, Ilara was lost in the flow. She didn't hear the silence of the room anymore. She only heard the music in her head. She remembered the tiny, cold room where she had practiced as a child. She remembered the neighbors banging on the walls because she played too loudly, telling her to be quiet, telling her to stop dreaming. She remembered the teachers who told her she didn't have the right look. For the piano, she took all of that rejection and poured it into the instrument. Every time she struck a chord, she was striking back at them. The music grew louder, faster, more intense. She was sweating now, a droplet of perspiration rolling down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. Her dress stuck to her back, but she didn't shift. She was entirely focused, a singular force of nature. The transition happened so smoothly that half the audience didn't realize it until it was already done. The chaotic, angry noise suddenly shifted. The heavy bass stopped. The jagged notes softened. The storm broke. From the violence of the sound, a gentle, haunting melody emerged. It was like the sun breaking through clouds after a hurricane. It was the same tune, the simple tune the judge had asked for, but now it was beautiful. It was sad, fragile, and incredibly lonely. She played it softly, her fingers barely touching the keys, coaxing a whisper of sound from the instrument. The contrast was overwhelming. The sudden shift from thunder to silence held the room in a vice grip. You could hear a pin drop. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. Everyone was leaning forward, caught in the trap she had set. The judge had stopped writing. He was just staring, his pen dangling loosely from his fingers. He looked confused, angry, but also terrified. He realized he had made a mistake. He had poked a sleeping dragon, thinking it was a lizard. Alara played the soft melody with a tenderness that made people want to weep. It was the sound of vulnerability, of a child wishing to be understood. But just as the audience began to relax, just as they thought the song was ending in a sweet, safe lullaby, her left hand began to creep back in. It started low, a rumble in the earth. The simple melody began to distort. She added notes underneath it that clashed, notes that made the pretty sound turn sour and anxious. The volume began to rise again, slowly at first, then gaining speed. She was taking them back up the mountain. She was showing them that the sadness wasn't the end. The fight wasn't over. She looked out at the sea of faces for the first time. She didn't see them as scary elites anymore. She saw them as just people. She saw their open mouths, their wide eyes. They were trapped. They were hers. A strange feeling began to bloom in her chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was power. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sense of power. She realized in that moment that they couldn't touch her. They could judge her clothes, her background, her simple request to play a tune, but they couldn't judge this. They couldn't deny this. She was better than them. Not because she was rich, and not because she was famous, but because she had something inside her that they couldn't buy or learn. She had a fire they didn't even know existed. Her fingers moved faster, the notes becoming a blur once again. The complexity was increasing. She was improvising now, weaving the simple tune in and out of complex jazz chords, classical runs and heavy rhythmic slams on the piano lid. It was a musical style that defied categorization. It wasn't classical, wasn't jazz, wasn't rock. It was pure emotion. The physical exertion was immense. Her arms ached, her lungs burned for air, but she didn't slow down. She felt like she was running a marathon at full sprint. The adrenaline pumped through her veins, pushing her harder, faster. She hit a wrong note, a slight slip, but she didn't flinch. She wove that mistake into the music instantly, turning it into a gritty accent that made the sound even more raw. It was perfect because it was real. She was nearing the climax now. The music was rising to a fever pitch. The audience was on the edge of their seats, breathless. They had forgotten who they were. The wealthy patrons had forgotten their status. The critics had forgotten their harsh words. They were just human beings. Overwhelmed by a sound that was stripping away their defenses, Alara looked down at her hands one last time. They were moving so fast, they looked like they weren't even attached to her body. They were separate entities, driven by the energy in the room. She felt the end coming. It was approaching like a freight train. It was going to be big. It was going to be loud. It was going to be the loudest thing this hall had ever heard. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs, and prepared to unleash the final wave. The sound grew until it felt less like music and more like a physical weight pressing against everyone in the room. It was a roar, a cascading waterfall of notes that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Just when the audience thought the volume couldn't possibly get any louder, Alara slammed her foot onto the sustain pedal, and the piano seemed to bellow in defiance. Her hands were a blur of motion, moving so fast that the individual keys were impossible to see. It looked like she was fighting a wild animal, her arms crossing over each other, her body swaying violently to the rhythm she was creating. The wooden bench creaked under her, threatening to slide across the stage, but she was anchored to it, completely lost in the storm. Then, with a suddenness that made people gasp, the chaotic wall of sound collapsed. She lifted her hands off the keys completely. The silence that rushed back in was instant and heavy. It was the kind of silence that hurts your ears, a vacuum where there was once noise. But Alara wasn't finished. She sat there for exactly 3 heartbeats, letting the panic of the silence settle in. The audience leaned forward, wondering if the machine had broken. Wondering if she had broken. Slowly, delicately, she lowered her right hand back to the piano. She played a single, high note. It rang out, clear as a bell, hanging in the air like a suspended star. Then another note, lower this time. Then a cluster of 3 notes, rippling down the scale. It was a melody they recognized instantly. But it didn't sound the way they remembered it. She was playing the simple nursery tune the judge had requested, but she had stripped it of its childish innocence. She played it in a minor key, turning the happy, bouncing rhythm into something that sounded like a funeral march. It was haunting, slow, and deeply sad. The change was jarring. A few seconds ago, they were being assaulted by noise. Now, they were being hypnotized by a melody they had sung as children. It felt wrong, yet it felt undeniably right. It was as if she was taking something familiar and forcing them to look at the dark side of it. As she played the slow, mournful tune with her right hand, her left hand began to creep in underneath. It wasn't playing the bass notes of the song. It was playing a rhythm, a slow, thumping heartbeat. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. It added a layer of tension. Like a countdown timer in a movie, the judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He looked at the other judges, his eyes asking, "What is she doing?" But they were all staring at the stage, completely transfixed. The mockery was gone from their faces. The arrogance had evaporated. They were now witnessing something they hadn't prepared for. They were witnessing a masterclass in emotional manipulation through music. Alara began to weave in variations. She took the simple 5-note melody of the nursery rhyme and began to stretch it. She added trills-wrapped wiggling of the fingers between 2 notes that made the sound shimmer. She added grace notes, tiny, flickering sounds that decorated the melody like jewelry. She was taking a stick figure drawing and turning it into the Mona Lisa. The physical strain was starting to show on her face. A bead of sweat rolled down her forehead and onto her nose, but she didn't wipe it away. Her breathing was heavy, her chest rising and falling visibly under her simple dress. Yet her touch on the keys remained feather-light. The contrast between the violence of her playing a moment ago and the tenderness of her playing now was terrifyingly beautiful. She began to speed up just a little. The heartbeat in her left hand got faster. The melody became more urgent. She was no longer playing the song straight. She was improvising around it, taking little detours into complex musical territory before snapping back to the simple tune. It was like she was teasing them, saying, "Here is your simple song, but look at where I can go with it." The sound began to fill the room again, but differently this time. It wasn't a loud, aggressive noise. It was a warm, enveloping wave. The acoustics of the hall, which usually made solo pianists sound small and isolated, were now working in her favor. The sound bounced off the walls and the ceiling, wrapping around the audience. People in the very back row, who usually couldn't hear the soft passages, were leaning forward, catching every whisper of the piano. A young man in the balcony, a music student who had been cynically analyzing her technique, stopped writing notes. He realized that her technique was flawless, but that wasn't what mattered. It was the intention behind it. He could feel exactly what she was trying to say. She was telling them a story about being underestimated. The simple tune represented how the world saw her: small, insignificant, childish. But the complex, swirling variations she was weaving around it were who she really was: deep, intelligent, and powerful. Ilara's hands were starting to ache, but she pushed the feeling away. She was entering the final stretch of her performance. She began to layer the sounds, playing the melody in the middle of the piano while her left hand played bass chords that were rich and deep, and her right hand played high, delicate notes that sparkled like diamonds above it all. She was creating a whole world with just two hands. The judge's face had gone pale. He realized with a sinking feeling in his stomach that he had made a terrible mistake. He had tried to humiliate her, thinking she was a nobody, a student who wasn't worth his time. He had used her for a cheap laugh to entertain the crowd. But the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They were mesmerized. He had given her the platform, and instead of failing, had used it to show the entire world exactly how brilliant she was. He looked down at his clipboard, where he had written a big, red 0. He picked up his pen, his hand shaking slightly, and scribbled it out. The music began to build again. The slow, sad tempo shifted, picking up speed. The minor key she had been using began to brighten, shifting into a major key that sounded triumphant. The heartbeat in her left hand turned into a driving rhythm. The simple tune was no longer a funeral march. It was an anthem. It was the sound of victory. She was playing faster now, her fingers flying, building the complexity back up. She was taking the audience on a journey back to the chaos, but this time it wasn't angry chaos. It was joyful chaos. It was the sound of breaking free. The sound swelled, filling every corner of the hall, vibrating the floorboards under the audience's feet. She was weaving the original melody in and out of intricate runs of notes that spanned the entire keyboard. Her hands were crossing over each other constantly, a dizzying display of skill. She was playing music that musicians twice her age with years of training couldn't play. Just when it seemed like the music couldn't get any more intense, she did something unexpected. She slammed her hands down on the low keys, creating a boom that shook the dust from the rafters. And then silence. Complete, total silence. She held her hands in the air, frozen in a pose of triumph. The audience didn't move. No one breathed. It was as if she had pressed a pause button on the world. They sat there, hearts racing, waiting for the next sound. They were captivated, hanging on the edge of a cliff, waiting to see what she would do next. They weren't bored anymore. They weren't checking their watches or thinking about dinner. They were completely hers. Asterisk, the silence stretched out, thin and trembling like a tightrope ready to snap. Ilara sat frozen, her hands suspended in the air above the keys. The audience held its breath, a collective intake of oxygen that seemed to suck the energy right out of the room. They were waiting, confused, wondering if the piece had ended or if something more was coming. The heavy thud of the bass notes still vibrated in the floorboards, echoing away into the high ceilings of the hall. Then it started. It wasn't a melody. It was a vibration. A low, rumbling hum that began deep inside the piano and seemed to rise up through the bench and into Ilara's body. Without moving her hands from the high frozen position, she stomped her foot on the soft pedal and then the sustain, causing the strings to shimmer with a ghostly resonance. Suddenly, her right hand dropped. It wasn't a gentle fall. It was a precise, calculated strike. She began to play a run of notes that defied logic. It was a jazz chord, but twisted, angry, and full of blues. She took the simple tune the judge had demanded, and she shredded it. She played it backwards. She played it upside down. She took the innocent melody and turned it into a dark, swinging rhythm that made people want to tap their feet, even though they were terrified. This was the improvisation. This was where the true danger lay. Written music is safe. It has rules. But what she was playing now came straight from her gut. It was raw and unpolished. It sounded like a conversation she was having with herself. A heated argument where she was winning. The complexity was staggering. Her left hand was jumping across the lower keys, playing a bounding rhythmic pattern that drove the song forward like a speeding car. Her right hand was darting around the middle and high registers, playing notes that didn't seem to belong together until they landed. It was chaotic, yet it made perfect sense. It sounded like the soundtrack to a chase scene in a movie, the kind where the hero is running through alleyways, dodging bullets and climbing fences. The judge sat up straighter. He had been slouching in his chair, looking bored earlier, but now he was gripping the edge of his table. His knuckles were white. He knew music theory. He had studied at the best conservatories in the world, and he knew that what she was doing was technically impossible. Or, at least, it should have been. The patterns she was weaving required a level of independence between the left and right hands that took decades to master. Yet here was this young woman, dressed in rags, doing it without even looking at the keys. She threw her head back, her eyes closed. The sweat was pouring down her face now, matting her hair to her forehead. She wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. She was running on pure instinct. Her fingers felt like they had a mind of their own. They were channels for the energy in the room. She could feel the fear and the tension of the audience. She was feeding it back to them, through the piano, amplified and distorted. The music shifted again. The driving, rhythmic bass slowed down. It turned into a heavy, dragging beat. The melody in her right hand became elongated, stretching out into long, sorrowful notes that cried out in the night. She was playing the blues now, deep and dirty. It was a sound that belonged in a smoky, underground jazz club at 2 a.m, not in a pristine, velvet-draped concert hall. It felt like she was violating the rules of the building, and the audience loved her for it. A man in the front row, a wealthy donor known for his stiff posture and cold demeanor, found his foot tapping. He tried to stop it, annoyed with himself. He didn't like jazz. He didn't like this noise, liked order and tradition. But the rhythm was infectious. It got under his skin. He looked around and saw the young people in the rows behind him, swaying in their seats, their eyes glued to the stage. Even the ushers standing by the doors had stopped checking tickets and were watching. Alara's physical exertion was reaching its peak. Her shoulders were heaving. Her dress was soaked through at the back. But she didn't slow down. Instead, she ramped it up. She began to play the same complex riff over and over again, but faster each time. It was a loop, a spiral that was pulling everyone in. The notes became a blur of sound, a wall of noise that was overwhelming. She was daring them to look away. She was daring them to judge her now. And then, in the middle of this chaotic storm, she did something that made the breath catch in everyone's throat. She seamlessly transitioned back into the nursery rhyme. But it wasn't the simple version. It was the theme hidden inside the chaos. For a few bars, the wild jazz ran on top. But the underlying melody was the twinkle twinkle rhythm the judge had mocked. She had tamed the beast. She had taken the wild music she had created and bent it to her will, forcing it to carry the tune he wanted. It was an act of defiance. It was her saying, I can play your simple game, but I can do it while doing things you can't even imagine. The sound was huge. It filled the entire space. It wasn't just coming from the piano anymore. It felt like it was coming from the walls, the floor, the very air. The vibrations were shaking the sheet music on the stands of the musicians in the orchestra pit behind her. The judge looked defeated. He sat back in his chair, his face slack. He looked at the other judges, but they were shaking their heads slowly, not in disapproval, but in disbelief. They knew they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. They knew that no matter what happened after she walked off that stage, nothing would ever be the same. They couldn't humiliate her anymore. She had risen above them, soaring on wings of sound. Alara could feel the end approaching. It was a physical sensation, a tightening in her chest. She knew she had one last burst of energy to give. She began to play higher and higher up the keyboard. The notes became sharp and piercing, like a siren. The bass in her left hand became a roar, hammering out the beat with the force of a drum. She was playing faster than she ever had in her life. Her arms were a blur. The risk of a mistake was high, but she didn't care. She threw caution to the wind. If she messed up now, it didn't matter. The feeling was too strong. She was going for the climax. The entire hall was vibrating. The sound was so loud it was almost uncomfortable, pressing against the eardrums, but it was a glorious discomfort. It felt like being in the center of a storm where the wind is so strong you can't stand, but you don't want to hide. You want to scream into the wind, she'll hit the final run. It was a cascade of notes starting from the top of the keyboard and tumbling all the way down to the bottom. A waterfall of sound that crashed into the deep, dark bass notes at the bottom. It was a musical avalanche. And then, with a force that rattled the piano lid, she slammed her hands down on the final chord. It wasn't just a chord. It was an explosion. She held it. She leaned into the piano, putting her entire body weight into the keys, sustaining the sound with the pedal pressed all the way to the floor. The chord rang out, huge and dissonant, shaking the dust from the rafters. It was a sound of victory. It was a sound of war. It was the loudest thing the hall had ever heard. She held it for what felt like an eternity. The audience was paralyzed. They couldn't clap. They couldn't speak. They could only sit there and let the sound wash over them, vibrating in their chests, echoing in their bones. Finally, slowly, Ilara lifted her hands from the keys. The sound cut off instantly. She released the pedal, and the vibration was sucked away into the silence. She sat there, chest heaving, sweat dripping onto the keys, staring straight ahead. She didn't move. She didn't bow. She just sat, breathing, as the silence of the hall rushed back in to fill the void where the music had been. It was the quietest the building had been in 100 years. Asterisk. The silence that filled the hall was not the same silence that had existed before. It wasn't a polite, waiting silence. It wasn't the silence of people being bored or checking their phones. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the air right out of the room. The final chord Ilara had struck had seemed to hang in the air for a minute, vibrating against the walls, the ceiling, and the very chests of the people watching. But now, even the vibration had faded, leaving nothing but a ringing in the ears. Ilara sat frozen on the bench. Her chest was heaving, her lungs burning for air, as if she had just sprinted a mile. Her hands rested heavily in her lap, trembling slightly from the adrenaline that was still coursing through her veins like electricity. She could feel the sweat cooling on her forehead, making her skin prickle with cold. She stared straight ahead at the black fall of the piano, her vision blurring at the edges. She didn't move. She was terrified that if she moved, the spell would break, and she would just be a girl in a cheap dress again. Time seemed to have stopped. No one in the audience moved a muscle. The judges were motionless, their mouths slightly open. The man in the front row, the wealthy donor who had been tapping his foot, sat rigid, his hands gripping his knees. Even the ushers near the doors stood as if they had been turned to stone. It was as if everyone in the room had collectively forgotten how to breathe. The only sound in the entire vast space was the harsh, ragged breathing of the young woman on the stage. Then, a single sound broke the spell. It wasn't a clap. It was the scrape of a chair in the back row. Someone stood up. Ilara flinched slightly, closing her eyes for a brief second. She expected to hear booing. She expected to hear shouting. She expected the judge to grab his microphone and order her off the stage for disobeying him. She braced herself for the humiliation she had feared all her life. Instead, a voice called out from the darkness of the back of the hall. Yes. It was a loud, masculine shout, raw with emotion. It sounded like a release, like a dam breaking. Then came another sound. A clap. It was sharp and deliberate. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the single clapping turned into a rhythm. And then it spread like a wildfire. The explosion of noise was instantaneous. It didn't build slowly. It erupted. The entire audience seemed to rise as one single entity. The silence was shattered by a roar of applause that was deafening in its intensity. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a thunderous, chaotic wave of sound that crashed over the stage. People were standing on their seats. Whistles pierced the air. Someone was stomping their boots on the floor. Ilara sat there, stunned. She opened her eyes and looked out into the blinding lights, trying to see the faces behind them. All she could see was a blur of motion, a sea of people standing and cheering. The sound was overwhelming. It washed over her, warming her cold skin. She felt a lump form in her throat, hot and tight. She had expected rejection. She had prepared herself for cruelty. But this was acceptance. This was triumph. Slowly, shakily, she stood up. Her legs felt like jelly, weak and wobbly, but she forced them to hold her weight. She turned to face the audience. As she turned, the volume of the cheering seemed to increase, if that were even possible. A spotlight hit her face, bright and blinding, but she didn't shy away from it this time. She blinked into the light, a small, bewildered smile touching her lips. She looked toward the judge's table. The head judge, the man who had tried to humiliate her, was sitting down. He wasn't clapping. His face was pale, his expression a mixture of shock and shame. He looked at her, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. He slowly lowered his gaze, looking down at his hands on the table. He couldn't look at her. He had been defeated not by an argument, but by a truth he couldn't deny. The other judges, however, were on their feet. They were clapping wildly, some of them wiping tears from their eyes, smiling at her with genuine warmth and admiration. Ilara felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly knocked her over. She had done it. She had proven them all wrong. Every person who had ever told her she wasn't good enough. Every teacher who had passed her over. Every snide comment about her background. It was all dust now. The only thing that mattered was the music and the power it had to change a room. She gave a small, awkward curtsy. It wasn't a professional, polished bow. It was clumsy, almost childlike, but it was honest. She held her hands together in front of her chest in a gesture of thanks. The applause didn't stop. It kept going, wave after wave, crashing against the stage. The shouts of bravo. An encore rang out. They wanted more. They didn't want her to leave, but Ilara knew she was done. She had nothing left to give. The energy that had fueled her performance had been spent, leaving her empty but light. She took a deep breath, savoring the air, the smell of the dust, the lights, and the roar of the crowd. She wanted to bottle this moment and keep it forever. She turned and began to walk off the stage. Every step felt difficult, as if she were walking through water. Her legs were still trembling, but she walked with her head high. As she passed the piano, she rested her hand on the glossy wood for a brief second, like saying goodbye to a friend. The keys were still warm from her touch. As she walked into the wings, the heavy velvet curtain brushed against her shoulder. The stage manager was standing there, his mouth open, his eyes wide. He looked at her as if he were seeing a ghost. A younger stagehand, a boy with messy hair who was usually more interested in his phone, was staring at her with undisguised hero worship. "You were amazing," the stage manager stammered, finding his voice. "I've never heard anything like that." Ilara didn't say anything. She just nodded, a tired but genuine smile spreading across her face. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a calmness that she hadn't felt in years. The heavy burden she had carried, the need to prove herself, the fear of not being enough, had lifted. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. She knew who she was. Behind her, the applause was finally starting to die down, changing into a rumble of excited chatter. The audience wasn't going to forget this night. They were going to talk about it at dinner. They were going to write about it in their journals. And they were going to remember the girl who was told to play a simple tune, but shocked them all instead. Ilara walked down the long, dim hallway backstage, away from the lights and the noise. The air back here was cool and smelled of old paint and dust. It was quiet. She found a small crate in the corner and sat down. Leaning her head back against the brick wall, she closed her eyes and listened. The distant roar of the crowd was still audible, a faint humming echo of the storm she had created. But in here, in the quiet dark, she just listened to her own heartbeat. It was slowing down, returning to its normal rhythm. She felt a profound sense of solitude, but it wasn't a lonely feeling. It was the solitude of someone who has climbed a mountain and is finally sitting at the top, looking down at the world below. She thought about the judge's face. She didn't feel anger toward him anymore. She felt pity. He lived in a world of rules and measurements, where everything had to fit in a box. He tried to put her in a box, but she was too big for it. She was too wild, too real. A thought crossed her mind. This is just the beginning. It wasn't a thought of ambition or greed. It was a simple truth. Tonight was a door opening, not a conclusion. She knew that tomorrow she would go back to her small apartment. She would still have to worry about money, and she would still have to wear her old clothes. But something inside her had changed fundamentally. She had touched a power that no one could take away from her. She looked down at her hands. They were reddened from the exertion, the fingertips slightly swollen. They were ordinary hands, but they were capable of extraordinary things. Ilara took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, a long, shaky breath that released all the remaining tension in her body. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt. It was still just a simple dress. But when she walked back out into the world, she wasn't just the girl in the simple dress. She was a musician. She was a force, and she was ready for whatever came next.